The story I'm about to tell is one of privilege, betrayal, and unimaginable horror. It is a tale that shook not just Brazil but captured the morbid curiosity of the world. At the heart of it is Suzane Von Richthofen, a young woman born into wealth and privilege, living a life many could only dream of. Yet, despite having everything handed to her on a silver platter, she orchestrated the brutal murder of the very people who gave her that life, her parents. This isn't just a crime story, it's a psychological journey into what drives someone to commit such a heinous act. Was it love? Greed? A twisted sense of entitlement? These are the questions that haunt those who hear the details of this case. The setting of privilege. Picture the bustling city of São Paulo, Brazil. A place where the divide between rich and poor is stark, where towering glass skyscrapers cast shadows over sprawling favelas. In the heart of this vibrant metropolis was the Von Richthofen family, a symbol of success and prosperity. Manfred von Richthofen was a respected German engineer, the director of a major company, and a man known for his discipline and work ethic. His wife, Marizia, was a highly regarded psychiatrist, a woman who had dedicated her life to understanding the human mind. Together, they built a life of affluence, providing their two children, Suzane and Andreas, with every opportunity imaginable. Their home was a luxurious mansion nestled in a wealthy neighborhood, equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, a testament to their privileged lifestyle. Suzane and Andreas attended the best schools, had access to elite social circles, and were set to inherit a multi-million-dollar fortune. From the outside looking in, they seemed like the perfect family. But as we've seen time and time again, appearances can be deceiving. Suzane was a bright and charismatic young woman. She excelled academically, was well liked by her peers, and had a future filled with promise. But behind the polished exterior was a young girl who felt stifled by her parents' rules and expectations. When she met Daniel Kravenhaus in 1999, everything changed. Daniel was the antithesis of Suzane's world, a man from a lower-income background with little ambition, a history of drug use, and no stable job. To Manfred and Marizia, Daniel was a threat to their daughter's future, a disruption to the carefully curated life they had built for her. At first, they tolerated the relationship, perhaps hoping it was just a fleeting teenage romance. But as Suzane grew more infatuated with Daniel, her parents' patience wore thin. They disapproved of the relationship and refused to support Suzane's desire to move in with him. This decision marked the beginning of a rift that would eventually turn deadly. What makes someone turn on their own family? It's a question criminologists and psychologists have pondered for decades. In Suzane's case, the seeds of betrayal were sown in her growing resentment toward her parents. Her love for Daniel, coupled with her parents' disapproval, created a toxic brew of defiance and entitlement. When they refused to fund an apartment for her and Daniel, Suzane saw it not as a reasonable parental decision but as an unforgivable betrayal. It was this warped perspective that led her down a dark path, a path where the solution to her problems wasn't compromise but murder. Love is often portrayed as a force for good, something that brings out the best in people. But in this story, love became a weapon, a justification for greed and violence. Suzane's love for Daniel was obsessive and blinding. It made her willing to destroy the very people who had given her everything. And Daniel, for his part, was all too willing to go along with the plan, driven by his own ambitions and greed. Together, they crafted a plot that was as chilling as it was calculated. They weren't content with merely rebelling against her parents, they wanted them gone permanently. On the night of October 31, 2002, the Von Richthofen mansion stood in eerie silence. Halloween may have been a night of spooky tales and harmless scares for most, but for the Von Richthofens, it would be a night of real horror. Suzane had meticulously planned every detail. She ensured her brother Andreas was out of the house, attending a LAN party with friends. She disabled the security system, paving the way for Daniel and his brother Christian to enter the home undetected. As the city of São Paulo buzzed with Halloween festivities, Suzane's parents lay asleep, blissfully unaware of the terror that was about to unfold. This was a night that should have been like any other, a family safe in their home, dreams undisturbed. But greed and betrayal had other plans. What drives a person to such darkness? Was it the intoxicating pull of forbidden love, the lure of wealth, or a complete loss of empathy? As we delve deeper into this story, prepare yourself for twists that defy comprehension and a crime that remains one of the most infamous in Brazil's history. As the clock struck midnight on October 31, 2002, the streets of São Paulo were still alive with the remnants of Halloween celebrations. The cool night air was filled with distant sounds of laughter, faint music, and the occasional burst of fireworks. However, behind the thick, gated walls of the Von Richthofen mansion, an eerie calm hung in the air, one that would soon be shattered by unspeakable violence. Inside the luxurious home, Manfred and Marizia von Richthofen had retired to bed, completely unaware of the plot that had been set into motion by their own daughter. Suzane, their bright and seemingly loving eldest child, had orchestrated every detail with chilling precision. Her brother Andreas, just 15 years old at the time, had been conveniently sent away to a LAN party, ensuring he would be far from the impending crime scene. With Andreas out of the picture and the security system disabled by Suzane herself, the mansion, once a symbol of safety and affluence, had become a vulnerable target. Daniel and Christian Kravenhaus, dressed in dark clothing and armed with crowbars, waited outside the mansion. Their nerves buzzed with adrenaline. Christian, Daniel's older brother, had been roped into the plot by promises of wealth and loyalty to his sibling. Neither man had any experience with violence on this scale, but greed and the influence of Suzane had clouded their judgment. Suzane gave them the signal. The gates were unlocked, the security system deactivated. The Kravenhaus brothers slipped silently into the mansion, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. Manfred and Marizia were fast asleep in their bedroom, their breathing steady and peaceful. The Kravenhaus brothers crept closer, their weapons clenched tightly in their hands. Christian was the first to strike, bringing his crowbar down on Manfred's head with brutal force. The sickening sound of bone cracking echoed through the room. Blood splattered across the pristine white bedding. Manfred, dazed but still alive, let out a groan of pain. Marizia woke up in horror, her eyes wide with disbelief. Before she could scream, Daniel lunged at her, striking her repeatedly with his crowbar. She fought back, her instincts as a mother driving her to protect her husband and herself, but the blows kept coming. Desperate to silence her, the brothers grabbed a plastic bag and towels, suffocating her until her body went limp. The bedroom, once a place of comfort and rest, had become a gruesome crime scene, a nightmarish tableau of blood, violence, and betrayal. With the murders complete, the Kravenhaus brothers and Suzane set about staging the crime scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. They ransacked the house, scattering papers and valuables across the floor. Jewelry boxes were emptied, drawers pulled open, and furniture overturned. They took care to wipe down surfaces, attempting to eliminate any traces of their presence. Suzane, disturbingly composed, guided them through the process, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. Once satisfied with their handiwork, they left the mansion, their clothes stained with blood and their minds heavy with the weight of what they had just done. At 4 a.m., Suzane and Andreas returned home from the LAN party, pretending to be shocked upon discovering the gruesome scene. Suzane's performance was Oscar-worthy, tears streaming down her face, voice trembling as she called the police. Neighbors were awakened by the commotion and gathered outside the mansion, their faces etched with concern and disbelief. News of the murders spread rapidly, and soon the media descended upon the scene, turning the Von Richthofen mansion into a spectacle of tragedy. When law enforcement arrived, they were met with a scene straight out of a horror movie. The bedroom was a blood-soaked mess, the bodies of Manfred and Marizia lying lifeless on the bed. The brutality of the murders was evident, and the staged robbery did little to mask the true nature of the crime. Detectives immediately noted several red flags. Despite the apparent robbery, valuable items such as electronics and cash had been left untouched. The security system had been deactivated, suggesting inside knowledge. Suzane's behavior, while outwardly distraught, raised suspicions. Her tears seemed forced, her demeanor too controlled for someone who had just lost both parents in such a violent manner. In the days following the murders, Suzane's behavior became increasingly erratic. Instead of mourning her parents, she hosted a pool party at the mansion, inviting friends over as if nothing had happened. Daniel and Christian, meanwhile, flaunted newfound wealth. Christian, previously broke, suddenly had enough cash to purchase a brand new motorcycle. Their reckless actions would soon catch up with them. The crime was as brutal as it was calculated. But what stands out most is the cold detachment displayed by Suzane and her accomplices. This was no crime of passion, it was premeditated, deliberate, and heartless. The question that lingers is, how does a daughter reach a point where she sees murder as the solution to her problems? And what does it say about human nature when love, greed, and manipulation collide? The night that Suzane von Richthofen's parents were murdered was not an ordinary one, and neither was Suzane. To understand the chilling motivations behind her actions, we need to look deeper into her psyche, unraveling the complexity of a young woman raised in luxury but driven to commit an unthinkable crime. What made her go from being a privileged daughter to a calculating murderer, orchestrating the death of the very people who had given her everything? In the days leading up to the crime, Suzane was in turmoil. She had fallen deeply in love with Daniel Kravenhaus, a man from a humble background, and though her parents had initially allowed the relationship, they soon saw him as an obstacle to their daughter's future. Daniel was the type of person they disapproved of: unambitious, uneducated, and without a stable career. They had hoped that Suzane would choose someone who could offer her the future they envisioned, one filled with opportunity, education, and a continuation of the family legacy. But Suzane wasn't interested in that. She didn't want the life her parents had planned for her. She wanted to live life on her own terms, with Daniel by her side, even if it meant severing the ties to everything her parents had given her. It was then that Suzane's sense of entitlement began to take over. Born into a wealthy family, Suzane had everything she could possibly need. Money, status, education, and an inheritance that would set her up for life. This was the world she knew. But it wasn't enough. Suzane wasn't satisfied with just living in luxury. She wanted control over her own destiny, regardless of the cost. When her parents refused to help her and Daniel move into their own apartment, it felt to Suzane like a betrayal. She had grown accustomed to having everything at her fingertips, and the sudden denial ignited a deep-seated anger. But this wasn't just about an apartment, it was about power, about independence, about freedom from the control of her parents. And so, the idea began to take root: if her parents wouldn't give her what she wanted, she would simply take it from them. In her mind, they had no right to stand in her way. Her relationship with Daniel was a source of rebellion, a symbol of freedom that she was willing to protect at any cost. But it wasn't just love that drove Suzane, it was greed. Suzane's desire for a life free from her parents was not just about emotional independence, it was about financial freedom. With her parents out of the picture, she would inherit their wealth and, perhaps more importantly, the life she had always dreamed of, one without the constraints of parental authority. This desire to control her own destiny, fueled by an overwhelming sense of entitlement, set the stage for the most horrific of actions. Daniel Kravenhaus, meanwhile, was an unlikely accomplice. A man from a working-class background, Daniel had his own demons: substance abuse, lack of ambition, and a history of petty crime. He had no wealth or status, but he had Suzane. To him, the idea of eliminating her parents wasn't entirely foreign. After all, it meant a life with Suzane, free from the judgment of her family. Though he may not have shared Suzane's exact motivations, he was willing to go along with her plan. The bond between the two was deep, and Daniel would do whatever it took to keep Suzane in his life. As the plan took shape, Suzane manipulated her brother Andreas, convincing him to go to a LAN party to ensure he wouldn't be home when the murders occurred. With her brother safely out of the way was clear. Suzane disabled the home security system, allowing Daniel and his brother Christian to enter the house undetected. The murder itself was brutal, cold, and executed with chilling efficiency. Manfred and Marizia were attacked while they slept, their lives violently stolen in their most vulnerable moment. The brothers used crowbars, towels, and a plastic bag to end their lives, staging the scene to resemble a botched robbery. But even more chilling was Suzane's reaction after the murders. When she returned to the house with Andreas, she pretended to be shocked, feigning disbelief and grief. Her acting was so convincing that even the police couldn't immediately see through the facade. Suzane's calm and composed demeanor in the face of her parents' violent deaths showed a complete lack of empathy. It was as if the loss of her parents was nothing more than a necessary sacrifice to achieve her goals. As the investigation progressed, Suzane's behavior only grew more suspicious. While the police were piecing together the clues, Suzane hosted a pool party at the mansion just days after the murders, as though life had simply gone on. This behavior was consistent with a deeper psychological issue, perhaps a narcissistic personality disorder. Suzane was not the loving daughter who had lost her parents, she was the manipulator, the mastermind who saw the murder as a means to an end. Her lack of genuine grief and her apparent indifference to the pain of others reflected a disturbing disconnect from the reality of her crime. This lack of empathy was evident in the way Suzane dealt with the aftermath. Her focus was on how the murders benefited her, on the wealth, the control, the freedom she had now achieved. The evidence against her mounted as police found inconsistencies in her story, but Suzane's ability to manipulate the situation continued. When Daniel and Christian were arrested, Suzane initially tried to shift all the blame onto them, denying her involvement. But the evidence was clear. She had been the one who set everything in motion, the one who had masterminded the crime. In many ways, Suzane's actions are a reflection of a deeper societal issue, the corruption of entitlement. She grew up with everything she could ever want, and yet it wasn't enough. She wanted more, not just material wealth but the complete freedom to live her life as she saw fit, regardless of the consequences. In her mind, the murder of her parents was justified because they had dared to stand in her way. The psychological complexity of her motivations speaks volumes about the darker side of privilege, the idea that some people believe they deserve everything, no matter who they have to hurt to get it. At the heart of the Von Richthofen case is a question that cannot be easily answered: how does love and rebellion turn into murder? Suzane's cold, calculated actions suggest a personality driven not by emotion, but by an overpowering sense of entitlement and control. She saw her parents not as family, but as obstacles in the way of her freedom, and in her twisted logic, eliminating them was the only way to get what she wanted. The case remains one of the most shocking examples of familial betrayal, and as it unfolds, it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, the impact of privilege, and the lengths people are willing to go to for freedom, wealth, and control. Suzane von Richthofen is not just the product of her environment, she is a stark reminder of what can happen when a sense of entitlement is left unchecked, when love and rebellion become the justification for murder. The investigation into the brutal murders of Manfred and Marizia von Richthofen seemed straightforward at first, but as the days went by, the police began to notice something was amiss. Suzane's reaction to the crime was perplexing, her behavior raising suspicions that the idyllic picture she painted of a shocked, grieving daughter didn't quite add up. What seemed like a typical robbery gone wrong was slowly unraveling into a complex web of lies, deception, and betrayal that would shock the nation. On the morning of November 1, 2002, when Suzane and Andreas returned to the family home, they were greeted by a horrific sight. Manfred and Marizia's lifeless bodies lay in their bed, surrounded by signs that suggested a violent robbery. The house had been ransacked, drawers overturned, and valuables left untouched. To an untrained eye, it appeared as though the intruders had been looking for money or valuable items but had failed to find anything substantial. At first glance, the situation seemed to follow the pattern of many home invasion robberies that had turned violent, with criminals having no particular agenda except theft. However, the police quickly began to see signs that all was not as it seemed. The more Suzane spoke about the events of the night, the more inconsistencies appeared in her story. Initially, she claimed that after discovering the crime scene, she had been in shock, not knowing what had happened. But police quickly noted her calm demeanor. There was no visible distress, no outpouring of emotion, just a cold and composed young woman. Moreover, Suzane's timeline didn't seem to make sense. She had told police that she and Andreas had been at a LAN party during the time of the murders, but there were no witnesses who could confirm her alibi. The investigators began to question the validity of her version of events, and her behavior only heightened their suspicions. Adding to the strange nature of her actions, Suzane soon after began hosting a pool party at the family mansion, just days after her parents were murdered. This behavior was in stark contrast to the grief expected from someone who had just lost both parents in such a violent way. It seemed callous, detached, and, most importantly, abnormal. As the investigation continued, one of the most important breakthroughs came from an unlikely source, a tip-off from a person who knew the Kravenhaus brothers. It was revealed that Christian Kravenhaus, Daniel's brother, had recently purchased a new motorcycle, one that was far beyond his means. Despite being unemployed and living on little more than social assistance, Christian had used cash to pay for the bike, a red flag that raised suspicions. The investigators took this lead seriously and immediately brought Christian in for questioning. Under the pressure of the police interrogation, Christian began to crack. He confessed to his role in the murder of the Von Richthofen couple and, in doing so, implicated both his brother Daniel and Suzane as the masterminds behind the crime. Despite Christian's confession and the mounting evidence against her, Suzane's response was to deny everything. She continued to paint herself as a helpless victim, trying to distance herself from the crime and shift the blame entirely onto Daniel and his brother. In a desperate attempt to manipulate the investigation, Suzane claimed that she had not been involved in planning the murders and that Daniel had coerced her into allowing the crime to take place. She portrayed herself as a victim of Daniel's controlling influence, but the evidence told a different story. As the investigation into the Von Richthofen murders deepened, detectives began to look closely at the financial motivations behind the crime. Suzane had an immense fortune awaiting her, a multi-million-dollar inheritance from her parents' estate. With her parents out of the picture, Suzane stood to inherit everything, giving her the wealth and independence she had been craving. Investigators uncovered that Suzane had been planning the murder for months, researching the best ways to kill her parents without leaving any trace. She had been involved in every step of the planning process, from disabling the security system to arranging for her brother to be absent from the home. In fact, Suzane had even given Daniel and Christian the tools they would need to carry out the murders. Suzane's own bank records revealed that she had been in contact with Daniel frequently, coordinating their efforts leading up to the murder. The police also discovered that Suzane had actively worked to create a false narrative after the crime, fabricating the robbery scenario and coaching Daniel and Christian on what to say. The more evidence was uncovered, the more it became clear that Suzane's role in the murders was not that of a passive bystander but rather that of a calculating mastermind. As the investigation drew to a close, the police arrested Suzane, Daniel, and Christian, each charged with the first-degree murder of Manfred and Marizia. Suzane's cold and composed demeanor during her arrest shocked many. She showed little emotion and continued to deny her involvement in the crime. Under interrogation, Daniel and Christian both provided additional details about Suzane's involvement, including her role in ensuring the success of the plot and her repeated insistence on eliminating her parents to gain access to their wealth. They both confirmed that it was Suzane who had driven the plan forward, and that they were simply following her lead. As the investigation continued, Suzane's family and friends were questioned about her behavior and possible signs of trouble in her life. Many of them noted her strained relationship with her parents, especially regarding her desire for financial independence and her relationship with Daniel. One of the most telling pieces of evidence came from a close friend of Suzane's, who revealed that Suzane had confided in her about the murders beforehand. The friend claimed that Suzane had openly discussed her frustration with her parents and had made cryptic comments about wanting to take control of her life without their interference. These revelations further solidified the police's suspicions that Suzane had, in fact, planned the murder for months and that she had carefully orchestrated every detail of the crime. As news of the arrest spread, the case became a media sensation in Brazil. The idea that a privileged young woman, someone who seemingly had everything, could betray and murder her parents for wealth was unfathomable. The public was shocked by Suzane's apparent lack of remorse and the cold, calculated nature of the crime. Television stations, newspapers, and online media outlets flooded the country with updates about the investigation and trial. Suzane's calm demeanor, her attempts to shift blame, and her seemingly unaffected reaction to her parents' death sparked outrage. The case became a symbol of family betrayal and the corruption of privilege. As the investigation came to a close, the full extent of Suzane's involvement was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming: her fingerprints, her phone records, her bank statements all pointed to a woman who had planned and executed the murder of her parents with chilling precision. By the time the case went to trial, there was no question that Suzane, Daniel, and Christian had orchestrated the brutal murders. Despite Suzane's repeated denials and attempts to shift blame, the truth was clear. The investigation had uncovered a dark, twisted plot driven by greed, entitlement, and a cold disregard for human life. The investigation into the Von Richthofen murders revealed the true depth of Suzane's manipulation and cold-heartedness. In the end, it wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, it was a crime driven by entitlement, love, and a twisted sense of justice. Suzane's calculated actions left an indelible mark on her family, and on Brazil itself, as the world watched in disbelief as the case unraveled before their eyes. The arrest of Suzane von Richthofen, along with her boyfriend Daniel Kravenhaus and his brother Christian, marked the beginning of the legal battle that would follow one of Brazil's most infamous and shocking crimes. The trial would expose the cold-blooded nature of the crime and the twisted motivations behind it, while also revealing Suzane's attempts to avoid responsibility and shift the blame onto others. The arrest and the ensuing trial were a dramatic spectacle that captured the public's attention and sparked national outrage. When the police arrested Suzane and the Kravenhaus brothers, it was a moment that many in Brazil had been waiting for. The investigation had already gathered substantial evidence pointing to their involvement in the murders, but the actual arrest came as a shock to the country, particularly because of Suzane's apparent lack of remorse or fear. At the time of her arrest, Suzane seemed eerily calm. She showed no emotion as she was led away in handcuffs, and her response to the situation was chilling in its detachment. The media quickly picked up on her cold demeanor, contrasting it with the expected reaction of someone who had just lost their parents in such a brutal and violent manner. Her attempt to distance herself from the crime, to deny any involvement, and to shift the blame onto Daniel did not sit well with the public. Her attitude was seen as a reflection of the entitlement and privilege that had defined her life before the murders, and the media quickly painted her as a calculating and manipulative figure. As the trial began in 2006, Suzane's defense strategy became clear. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, she continued to deny her involvement in the murder of her parents. Suzane claimed that she was manipulated by Daniel and that she had been a victim of his coercion. She painted herself as a young woman caught in a toxic relationship, unable to escape the influence of her boyfriend. This defense, however, did little to sway the public or the court. Suzane's calculated actions in the days leading up to the murder, her role in disabling the home security system, and her participation in planning the crime were all undeniable. The defense's attempt to portray her as a helpless pawn in the hands of Daniel fell flat, as the evidence painted a much darker picture. The prosecution, on the other hand, laid out a compelling case, showing that Suzane had played an active and central role in the murders. They argued that the motive was clear: Suzane wanted her parents dead in order to inherit their wealth and escape their control. Her manipulative actions, from convincing Daniel and Christian to carry out the murders to staging the scene as a robbery, were seen as cold and premeditated. While Suzane attempted to shift the blame onto Daniel, the Kravenhaus brothers also faced charges for their roles in the murders. Daniel, who had been involved in planning and carrying out the killings, was charged with first-degree murder, as was his brother Christian, who had helped Daniel in executing the brutal crime. Christian, in his confession, detailed how Suzane had played a significant role in the crime. He explained that Suzane had been the one to contact him and Daniel, initiating the plan to murder her parents. His testimony provided crucial evidence that Suzane had been involved from the beginning, disproving her claims of innocence. While Daniel's defense tried to portray him as a man under Suzane's control, their argument was similarly ineffective. The prosecution argued that Daniel, despite his troubled background, had acted with full knowledge of his actions and was complicit in the murders. As the trial progressed, public opinion was split. Some people sympathized with Suzane, seeing her as a victim of a bad relationship who had made a tragic mistake. They argued that her upbringing in a wealthy, overprotective family had made her vulnerable to manipulation. Others, however, viewed Suzane as the mastermind behind the crime, seeing her desire for wealth and independence as the driving forces behind the murders. Media outlets fanned the flames of this debate, constantly broadcasting trial updates and discussing the psychological aspects of the case. Suzane became a symbol of the dangers of privilege and entitlement, while also embodying the depths of human betrayal. The fact that Suzane, despite her conviction, continued to receive support from her family and some members of the public only fueled the debate. Many felt that she had not fully confronted the gravity of her actions and that she remained unrepentant. Others saw her attempts to appeal and reduce her sentence as a further indication of her refusal to accept responsibility for her role in the murders. After weeks of courtroom drama, the three defendants were convicted of first-degree murder in 2006. Suzane von Richthofen, Daniel Kravenhaus, and Christian Kravenhaus were all found guilty of planning and executing the murders of Manfred and Marizia. Suzane was sentenced to 40 years in prison, while Daniel received the same sentence. Christian, the younger of the two brothers, was given a slightly shorter sentence of 38 years. The sentence was a reminder of the seriousness of the crime and the cold-blooded nature of the planning that had gone into it. Suzane's conviction was particularly controversial, as many believed she had shown no remorse for the crime. Despite her efforts to minimize her role and shift blame, the court's decision sent a clear message that family betrayal and cold-blooded murder could not go unpunished, no matter the defendant's social status. Even after her conviction, Suzane continued to fight her sentence. Over the years, she made multiple attempts to reduce her prison term, arguing that she suffered from personality disorders and that these conditions had played a role in her actions. These appeals were met with skepticism. Many saw them as an attempt to evade responsibility and secure an early release. In 2015, Suzane petitioned for a reduction in her sentence, claiming that she had undergone significant psychological rehabilitation during her time in prison. She also sought to be transferred to a semi-open prison regime, where prisoners have greater freedoms and can leave the prison during the day for work or other activities. However, despite these efforts, Suzane's attempts to gain early release were unsuccessful. The courts maintained that her actions were deliberate, calculated, and cold-hearted, and that she must serve the full extent of her sentence. The Von Richthofen murders and the subsequent trial had a profound impact on Brazilian society. The case was widely discussed in the media, with many people unable to fathom how a young woman from such a privileged background could be involved in such a horrific crime. Suzane's role in the murders challenged the notion of innocence associated with wealth and privilege, and her lack of remorse left a lasting scar on the national consciousness. The case also led to a deeper examination of the dynamics of family relationships and the psychological factors that can drive someone to commit such a violent act. Psychologists and criminologists analyzed Suzane's behavior and motivations, discussing the potential role that entitlement, jealousy, and emotional detachment played in her decision to kill her parents. The trial of Suzane von Richthofen, Daniel Kravenhaus, and Christian Kravenhaus ended with a conviction, but the story did not end there. Suzane's attempts at appeal, her behavior in prison, and the ongoing public fascination with the case continued to keep her in the public eye. While the court's decision to convict the three defendants and sentence them to lengthy prison terms was seen as a victory for justice, many still questioned whether Suzane truly understood the gravity of her actions or whether she would ever feel genuine remorse for the deaths of her parents. The case remains one of the most shocking and controversial criminal trials in Brazilian history, and its impact will likely be felt for years to come. The Von Richthofen murders, in which Suzane von Richthofen conspired with her boyfriend Daniel Kravenhaus and his brother Christian to murder her wealthy parents, left a profound and lasting impact on the families involved, the Brazilian public, and the justice system. While the immediate aftermath was marked by shock, grief, and disbelief, the legacy of this horrific crime would extend far beyond the courtroom. The ripple effects were felt by Suzane's surviving family, particularly her traumatized younger brother, Andreas, and by the larger society, as the case sparked national conversations about privilege, family dynamics, and the nature of evil. The most immediate victim of this tragic event was not just Manfred and Marizia, but also their son, Andreas, who was left behind to cope with the aftermath of his parents' brutal murder. Andreas, who was just a teenager at the time, had been manipulated into leaving the house that fateful night, taken to a LAN party by his sister, Suzane. When he returned home, he was confronted with the gruesome discovery of his parents' bodies and the revelation that his sister, someone he had trusted and looked up to, had orchestrated their deaths. The trauma Andreas experienced was immense. He had already been forced into a dangerous situation by Suzane's manipulation, and the emotional toll of finding his parents murdered, coupled with the subsequent realization of his sister's involvement, would scar him for life. In the years following the murders, Andreas struggled with severe mental health issues. He was reported to have been in a state of deep shock and grief, with the burden of processing his family's violent end weighing heavily on his young mind. In interviews later on, Andreas revealed his difficulty in reconciling his love for his parents with the betrayal of his sister. While Andreas did not appear to have been complicit in the crime, the effect of losing both parents in such a horrific manner would never leave him. His life was forever changed by the murder, and his family, once a picture of privilege and wealth, had been destroyed. Andreas later distanced himself from Suzane and avoided any association with her public attempts to appeal her conviction. Despite the magnitude of her crime, Suzane's legacy is marked by a combination of notoriety and the ongoing public fascination that keeps her in the spotlight. While she remains in prison, Suzane has made multiple attempts to reduce her sentence, citing psychological disorders and claiming to have undergone personal rehabilitation. Her requests for early release have sparked further controversy, as many view her actions in the murders as calculated and ruthless. Some see her as an emblem of the dangers of privilege and entitlement gone wrong, a young woman who, despite having access to wealth, education, and opportunity, chose a path of greed and manipulation. Suzane's cold detachment during and after the crime, as well as her behavior in court, where she consistently denied her responsibility, left many with the impression of a woman who was more concerned with her own desires than with the value of human life. Additionally, Suzane's continued legal battles and attempts to reduce her sentence have added to her notoriety. Her supporters argue that she has served enough time and has shown signs of reform, while others feel that she has not fully accepted responsibility for the murders. Suzane's case remains controversial in Brazilian society, with opinions divided about whether she should ever be granted the chance for parole. In the wake of the murders, the Von Richthofen family mansion, once a symbol of wealth and success, stood abandoned for many years. The place where the horrific crime had occurred became a symbol of the broken family and the treachery that had unfolded within its walls. For a time, the mansion was left to decay, a reminder of the family's tragic fate. The mansion's future seemed uncertain, but in 2014, it was eventually sold. Its legacy, however, lingered. While the new owners would attempt to move on from its dark past, the mansion would forever be associated with the brutal killings. Some people in São Paulo would even visit the site, intrigued by the infamous history tied to the property. For those who remembered the case, the house would always be a chilling reminder of the betrayal and cold-heartedness that could arise from within a family. The Von Richthofen murders remained one of Brazil's most talked about and debated criminal cases. The story of Suzane, the privileged young woman who betrayed her parents for money and freedom, resonated with people on a deep level, sparking debates about the nature of evil, wealth, and entitlement. For many, Suzane was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the country's wealth divide, someone who had everything but still chose to destroy the very foundation of her family for personal gain. Brazilian media covered the case extensively, and it became a national obsession, with each new twist in the legal process capturing public attention. Suzane's courtroom appearances, her cold demeanor, and her controversial legal battles kept her in the media spotlight. Her case was discussed on talk shows, in documentaries, and in news outlets, making her one of the most infamous criminals in Brazilian history. The Von Richthofen case also raised deeper questions about the dark undercurrents of Brazilian society. How could a family with so much wealth and opportunity end up in such a tragic situation? How could someone who had been raised in an environment of privilege and comfort become capable of such horrific violence? Suzane's case prompted many to examine the psychological dynamics of family relationships and the factors that could drive someone to commit murder. For the Von Richthofen family, the murders would forever cast a shadow over their legacy. The murders of Manfred and Marizia were not just a crime against two individuals but an attack on the family's entire history. Their legacy was now defined by betrayal, an unimaginable act of violence committed by someone who should have been their daughter, the person they loved and protected. For Suzane, the legacy she left behind was one of infamy and moral ambiguity. Some may try to sympathize with her, seeing her as a victim of her own upbringing or a person who suffered from psychological issues. But for most, she remains a symbol of the darker side of human nature, someone who was driven by greed, selfishness, and a desire to escape the limitations of her own life. The cold, calculated way in which she orchestrated her parents' deaths shattered any illusion of innocence or vulnerability. The public's fascination with the case has ensured that the Von Richthofen murders will not be forgotten. The story of the young woman who killed her parents for money and freedom continues to haunt Brazilian society, and it remains a poignant reminder of the destructive potential of entitlement, privilege, and manipulation. While Suzane serves her sentence, the lasting impact of the crime reverberates far beyond the walls of her prison cell. The case of Suzane von Richthofen is, without a doubt, one of the most chilling and infamous stories of family betrayal in Brazil's criminal history. The shocking nature of her crime, the brutal, calculated murder of her parents at her own hands, has left a lasting scar on her family, her community, and the collective consciousness of the nation. But beyond the horrific details of the crime itself, the Von Richthofen case offers profound insights into the darker aspects of human psychology, family dynamics, and the consequences of privilege. Suzane's actions were driven by a toxic combination of entitlement, selfishness, and manipulation. Raised in a family of wealth and influence, she had everything at her disposal: education, comfort, and a future of security. Yet, instead of embracing these advantages, she chose to betray the very people who had given her everything. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that privilege alone is not enough to shield us from moral failings. Sometimes, it is the very sense of entitlement that fosters a dangerous disregard for others. The murder itself, while horrific, also underscores the complexity of human motivations. It is easy to label Suzane as a monster, but the deeper question remains: what drives a person to commit such an act? Is it greed alone? Or is it the toxic relationships within a family, the pressure to live up to expectations, or an overwhelming desire for freedom from familial control? While there are no easy answers, The Von Richthofen case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the complexities of human behavior. What is certain, however, is that the legacy of this crime is one of profound tragedy. For Andreas von Richthofen, the emotional toll of losing both parents to such a violent fate, compounded by the betrayal of his sister, is unimaginable. The scars left on him are a testament to the depth of the trauma he endured. For the Brazilian public, the case remains a haunting reflection of how entitlement, greed, and broken family dynamics can culminate in such an incomprehensible act of violence. Suzane, now serving time in prison, remains a controversial figure. Some believe she has served her time and deserves a chance at redemption, while others view her as a manipulative, cold-hearted individual who should never see freedom again. Her attempts to appeal her sentence and gain an early release only add fuel to the debate surrounding her culpability and future. As the case continues to linger in the public eye, questions about justice, punishment, and forgiveness remain unresolved. In the end, the story of Suzane von Richthofen is a sobering reminder that even the most seemingly perfect families can harbor dark secrets. It forces us to consider the psychological and emotional dynamics that shape our actions and the ways in which we are influenced by the pressures of wealth, family, and societal expectations. Most importantly, it serves as a cautionary tale, one that reminds us of the dangers of privilege unchecked and the devastating consequences that can arise when someone loses sight of the value of human life. This is where we leave the story of Suzane von Richthofen, but the conversation doesn't end here. We want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Suzane's actions and the legacy of this tragic case? Do you believe she deserves another chance, or is her crime unforgivable? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a discussion. If you found this video insightful, please don't forget to like and share it with your friends. By sharing this story, you help others understand the complexity of human behavior and the consequences of violence within families. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel for the latest updates on true crime stories, investigations, and the dark side of human nature. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more intriguing stories that delve into the mysteries of the criminal world.